Long time no see. Two guests joining from U.S. and China. Daniel Russell, Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Good to see you, Daniel. And in Shanghai, Shending Li, Professor at the Institute of International Studies of Fudan University. Good to see you, Professor. Great to have both of you, gentlemen. The reason we have both of heavyweights on our program is because there are some very important topics. Daniel, go to you first. Your takeaway of the latest results.
Thanks, Shenwei. Well, there's still a lot about the meeting that we don't know, but frankly, that's a good sign because real diplomacy has to be conducted in private if it's going to be a candid discussion, if it's going to be an exploration of what may be possible. I mean, peaceful coexistence is a low bar. I mean, of course, I hope we can achieve that at least, but it's encouraging that both sides seem interested in lowering tension and avoiding instability in the relationship. But it's still early days. We shouldn't jump to conclusions.
Too early to jump to conclusion, that's for sure. Professor Shen, what is the low bar for China?
Well, I think the message is the two sides have had candid and sincere, a very deep exchange of views. Candid means diplomatically quite different views and could be quite direct. But the sincere is a measure of the attitude. Chinese feel the U.S. counterparts came with sincerity, and probably we are measured in the same way by the U.S. counterpart. And that would make both sides feel the other side came to exchange views in a friendly manner. That matters.
We see a lot of new phrases, for example, re-engagement, recoupling, reassurance. But all of these phrases actually lead to one question, that is, what is the real nature of this relationship right now? And what are the actions that need to be taken by both sides for this new nature? Daniel, your take.
Well, Tianyan, it's much harder to repair something that's broken than it is to build it in the first place. And I think clearly the U.S.-China relationship has suffered very significant damage and needs to be retrieved. You know, both sides, at a minimum in Zurich, avoided an embarrassing and a damaging public exchange of insults, such as we've seen in the past. But what really matters is not the terminology or the labels that we attach to a meeting or to the relationship. It's going to be the behavior on both sides. But solving problems has to begin with listening to the other side. And if, in fact, the meeting in Zurich was the beginning of a shift from shouting at each other to listening to one another, that's an encouraging first step.
They listened to each other, according to public report, for 6 hours. The meeting took place for about 6 hours, an extended period of time. Certainly, they have listened to each other to quite extent. Professor Shen, Professor Shen, what do you say about the nature of the relationship and the action need to be taken in order to frame that relationship?
Well, the nature of the relationship is quite comprehensive and complicated. It does include many facets of the partnership. Sometimes the two sides share same interests. For instance, countering terrorism and controlling the rise of temperature. Sometimes they compete. U.S. want to sell more goods in order to promote Americans' economic competitiveness. And China want to do similar things, but the world only needs a certain amount of supply of goods. It does not need an oversupply. Then the two countries need to compete for quality, for technological competence, and for the cost effectiveness. For this, they may enter into certain competition. Hopefully, that kind of competition would be positive and healthy rather than destructive.
Of course, Professor Shen, you're aware that the Chinese side, Yang Jiechi, Mr. Yang Jiechi, for example, have been talking about opposing, framing the nature of U.S.-China relations totally with the word competition.
Yeah, he mentioned that China-U.S. relationship should not be defined as a relationship of competition. It is comprehensive. First and foremost, it's a cooperation. Student exchange, scientific exchange, sports and music exchange, lots of exchange to manage a bilateral relationship, to better the regional stability, and to improve global security. So we certainly have some competition, but the competition is not the main theme of the relationship. And we should develop the competition into a healthy track rather than to let the relationship to derail.
Of course, that's uncharted water, particularly under the current circumstances for both sides. We see, Mr. Russell, different voices coming out in Washington, including a longtime China expert, for example, Professor David Lampton, Susan Thornton, for example, both are China hands. They've been talking about if not cooperating, conflicts, it's very hard to avoid between the two sides. They're also been talking about there has been a long time ago a tipping point of the relationship between China and the United States. Mr. Russell, you've been serving in the government. Now you also run this Institute on China Policy. Tell me more about your assessment.
Well, I think there has been a gradual erosion of support in the United States for the kind of cooperative, engaged U.S.-China relationship that we had in the past several decades, in part born of real frustration over the perceived unwillingness of the Chinese side to cooperate in resolving problems where we had very significant differences. American business complained about state-sponsored cyber theft. American NGOs and academics complained about restrictions and repression placed on them, et cetera. And the government felt that we were having hours and hours and hours of talks through our various structured dialogues, but not getting any progress. Now, I know the Chinese side has their own list of complaints, and those complaints and those lists grew exponentially during the Trump presidency. But looking forward, I think it's a mistake to oversimplify the relationship by defined by either competition or cooperation. The fact is it's multifaceted, and all of those elements enter into the equation. I think Professor Shen made a very important point, which is that competition can be constructive if it's healthy competition. When it is destructive rivalry, it risks destabilizing the world and is a threat to both of our countries.
Professor Shen, while the high-level discussion taking place in Zurich, Switzerland, we've seen some recent actions from the United States. At least the Chinese media has been reporting about that. One is a special unit by the CIA on China threat. According to William Burns, the CIA head, that China is going to be this top geopolitical threat for the United States, quote unquote. And meanwhile, we also see reports suggesting U.S. special forces training forces in Taiwan, military forces in Taiwan, which of course China considers as a very sensitive issue. So Professor Shen, how is China reading the mixed signals?
Daniel has mentioned we should not simplify, to read the development in a simplified way. China-U.S. relationship is comprehensive, is having many facets. Despite Yang Jiechi, Jake Sullivan's meeting in Zurich, the two countries remain to have lots of challenges, especially Taiwan. China has made it clear that Taiwan and the mainland are parts of China, and they together make an entity of China, and we are entitled to reunification. It's our business. And friends, if they want to help, welcome, but nobody should be in a position to stand in front of us to prevent us from achieving our legitimate national interest. And America, for this purpose, has exactly stood before us to prevent all Chinese to attain their ultimate reunification in a way that they wish to attain. And we have waited for more than 40 years after sort of normalizing relations with the U.S., and we are very patient. We may not have the capacity, but at least we are genuine. And we would grow our capacity. That capacity is what we legitimately acquire, and that is not a threat to America. And any forces standing in front of us, preventing us from reunifying, is a threat to us. So China-U.S. now exactly read the other party in a very negative way. That's very unfortunate.
You know, gentlemen, there are many points in this bilateral relations that would create a great debate between the two knowledgeable experts like you. But I wouldn't go into every one of those because we don't have enough time today. But I want to talk about also the general direction of this. Now, the virtual meeting has been publicly agreed upon by the two sides, according to their statements after the meeting. So two presidents, virtual meeting, the end of the year, before that. That's all clear message. What do you think should be on the list of those talking points between these two presidents? Mr. Russell, briefly.
Well, I've been in many meetings between Chinese and American leaders, including the early discussions between the two vice presidents, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, and then later President Xi and President Obama at Sunnylands, where they were really getting to know each other. We have a big head start in that Joe Biden and Xi Jinping know each other, have a strong relationship, I believe, have some mutual trust. But they still need to begin with a description of their strategic goals and concerns. Each side needs to understand what the priorities are of the other. If we're headed towards a virtual summit, that's a good thing. An in-person meeting would be vastly, vastly better. There's no substitute for that. But also let's remember that, you know, reducing tensions, while it is an important objective, isn't the same as actually making progress. And in order to make progress, the two sides are going to have to tackle not only the areas where they could cooperate, but the areas where we have very stark differences, and the behavior of the other side is creating additional tension.
Professor Shen, the same question to you. What should be the talking points between these two presidents?
Well, they need to prepare for the summit in the virtual space by taking concrete steps in controlling the damage, and also by taking concrete steps in provide mutual benefits. So probably managing situation in Afghanistan, and taking further cooperative action for global climate changes management, and also anti-terrorism, and the nuclear proliferation issues, etc. I think they could conceive many important issues and taking incremental but important strategic steps for those middle-level leaders to implement their possibly their mutually agreed action program of action in a future virtual meeting to be held later this year.
Of course, that's a timeline, right? Later this year. But how is this timeline working with the longer stretch of time? You know, what does that mean? Are we coming into a prolonged period of time in which it's very hard to define exactly what we are having because it's changing, shifting all the time, gentlemen? But at the same time, there's some kinds of general direction. We are both in the bottom of our hearts understand where it is. Mr. Daniel Russell, go first, and then, of course, Mr. Shen. Please, Daniel.
Well, I'd make two quick points. One is that you're quite right to take a step back and look at the timeline with a longer perspective. Even if we're not thinking in decades, let's remember that only a year from now will be not only the 20th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party that may see President Xi obtain a third term, but there's also the U.S. midterm election.
That's
so
right.
Politics are going to increasingly affect decision making. Secondly, in the grand sweep of things, the relationship between China and the United States has fundamentally changed by virtue of the fact that China has now emerged with tremendous national wealth, tremendous military power, tremendous diplomatic and economic power, and has achieved or approached something like peer status. And that means the two sides have to find new and sustainable ways to deal with one another.
Daniel said it very matter-of-factly. And what about for you, Professor Shen? Also briefly, because we're running out of time. Professor Shen, your talking points.
2 points also. First, on the positive side of the relationship, the two countries should take a concrete action no matter they have a negative part of the relationship. The two countries should cooperate. At the same time, on the negative side, the two countries should learn how to define the bottom line, not to have a war, to have the strategic communication, not to misunderstand, and how the military need to follow the president, and how the military would work with the president in order to avoid a war. A war benefits nobody. So what is the bottom line and how to substantiate the bottom line should be a very important subject for the two presidents to address.
Brilliant points, I have to say, gentlemen, from both of you. Thank you so much for those wonderful advice. Daniel Russell, Shen Ding Li from U.S. and China. Really appreciate it. Have a great evening and have a great day.